Today we're out in the backyard vineyard, and I'm just going to talk about all the maintenance that you need to do if you want to grow a little vineyard like this in your suburban backyard. This can be super rewarding. It can save a ton of money, but if you don't do it right, your vines, not only will they decline, they'll probably actually die. There's a lot more that goes into grape growing that isn't necessarily evident when you're just, out there purchasing grapevines. In this little vineyard, we kind of have a mixture. These are all wine grapes, but there's going to be a mix of vinifera. So that's going to be your European grapes that are very little disease resistance, but very premium quality wine. And we also have some of your hybrid grapes. So these are the more modern hybrids that have excellent disease resistance. They also have great cold hardiness, but up until pretty recently, the wine quality was going to be somewhat poor. Now, these modern hybrids, though, especially when we're talking about white wines, are quite good. This is traminette. It makes excellent white wine. I'm replanting some grapes. I'm replanting some Riesling over to clarion. I'm also going to plant some, instead of Blaufränkisch, I pulled that. We're going to be planting petite pearl. So these are about as premium as you're going to get for hybrid grapes, and it's just going to make my life so much easier as a grower. The main vinifera that I'm left with here is Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Alvarinho, and Cabernet Sauvignon. They do okay. Merlot is probably actually the worst of all those in terms of just getting through the year unscathed. So on year one, when you plant these grapes, you're going to do a few things. You're really going to want to promote growth in that early stage. It's something you're not necessarily going to want to do later. So you're going to fertilize a little bit, unless your soil test shows that you're just, off the charts on your NPK. You're going to probably wipe out the grass around the vines. I hoed to do this. You can spray. Hoeing also has a benefit that it will prune the roots at the surface level. So it encourages that vine to dig deep. The other thing you're going to do is probably put the vines in some sort of grow tube. And what this will do is prevent things like rabbits, woodchucks, and deer from just chomping those things right off, because that's exactly what they're going to do. Once the vines start to kind of poke out of the grow tube, start to get some leaves on them, you are going to still have to do some spraying just to make sure that the leaves don't essentially fall off. We get so much downy mildew on the East Coast that if you don't do anything to prevent it, you're pretty much going to defoliate the vine. And that especially goes for your European varieties, your vinifera varieties. And for the most part, you're going to spray things like mancozeb, captan, phosphorus acid, immunox, but check with your local agricultural extension. So Penn State around here has a great ag extension that tells you exactly what to do. Cornell is great, Ohio State. All these schools do a lot of research on how to deal with those pests. For a little vineyard like this, though, a backpack sprayer will get you by, especially in those first couple years. But we'll talk about what you might want as you get into this big wall of leaves. That first couple years too, it's going to be really important to get those vines through the winter, and especially if you live somewhere like we do in Pennsylvania, where you can get below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not unusual. You might even get as low as like -5. Go a little farther north, you easily get into like -15. So first of all, you're going to want to plant varieties that can handle the extreme colds that you're going to get, but you're also going to want to do things like hilling up the base of the vines. So these hybrids, I don't really have to worry about that. The one that needs it more than anything here is going to be Merlot, because it'll get something called crown gall. It'll get splitting at the base of the trunk and just basically introduce disease at that trunk. So you're going to want to basically cover up to the first maybe 4 or 5 inches of that trunk with dirt. You could also cover it with straw. If you get a lot of snow, you could cover it with snow. If you're going to get really extreme colds, you could actually lay that vine on the ground and cover it with straw or snow as well. And that not only protects the trunk, it can also protect the whole vine. And One benefit of the hilling up is that if you get such an extreme cold that it'll kill the whole vine, well, everything under that hill is going to still be alive. And all these premium grapes are going to be grafted onto a different rootstock. So you need to make sure that some of what's above that graft is still alive, because you don't want to grow a new vine of rootstock. You want to grow a new vine of the actual grape that you have. As you get into year 2, I mean, by then you're going to want to make sure you have your posts in and your wires up, because you're going to start training that vine and establishing those cordones. In this case, everything in the vineyard here is vertical shoot positioned, where you kind of have this T shape at about 3.5 feet up from the ground, and everything goes up from there. If you're growing something like Concord or some of these hybrids that have more of a trailing habit versus a upright growth, you might do a single high wire. But regardless, year 2, you're going to want to start somewhat training that vine onto there. In year 2, you may start to see some fruit on the vines. If you do, for the most part, you're going to want to pull it. You might leave a couple clusters here and there just to try it out, but you don't really want the vine wasting all that energy creating fruit when what you're really trying to do is establish just the size of the vine so that the next year it can really start creating fruit. Again, this is the year you're gonna start getting a lot of leaves, just generally bigger vines. So, you know, spraying for the diseases is gonna be important, but what's gonna start to find your vineyard are gonna be these insect pests. I mean, in these small suburban vineyards where you have just lots of woods around, lots of gardens around, lots of untreated wild grapes in the woods, every pest that could be imaginable, you're gonna get it. In May, I get something called grapevine cane girdlers, and what they'll do is cut the top of the cane off and it'll break off. It'll look like a really super tall deer came through and just mowed your whole vineyard. This isn't a big problem for big vineyards. I think they just have enough vines they can handle a few, getting chopped. It is a big problem for me though. They would take out everything if I didn't treat them. You can use your household stuff that you would get at like Lowe's. 7, the insect spray works good on those. As we get into the end of June, we start to see Japanese beetles. Again, this isn't going to be a big problem for big vineyards, but on a small plot like this, they'll skeletonize like every leaf. One year we had a baby, so I was in the hospital for a few days and I came home and they just crushed it. I was able to survive, but I had a lot of damage that year because I just like to really watch for them, and when they show up, you pretty much got to spray that first day. Again, 7's going to work for that as well. Some of you guys might have something called the glassy winged sharpshooter. This is going to be especially if you live further south than I do, and that's a super bummer of a bug. It spreads something called Pierce's disease, and Pierce's disease not only will kill it's not that it will necessarily kill your vegetal growth, it'll kill the vine. It's basically a disease that infects the grapevine until it dies. Honestly, if you live that far south that you're gonna have Pierce's disease, your best bet is to plant vines that are resistant to the disease, because you're almost not gonna be able to keep these bugs from spreading it. There's an unfortunate new pest I have to deal with in Pennsylvania called the spotted lanternfly. I saw maybe 2 years ago. Last year I probably saw 5,000, not exaggerating. I don't know what's going to happen this year, but I have a feeling we're going to get a lot of pressure from the spotted lanternfly, especially being that this vineyard is like a magnet for every pest because it's the tastiest thing in town. Again, 7, especially the new formulation, which is zeta cypermethrin, is extremely effective on lanternflies. And another problem with the lanternfly though too is they're not here and gone in 2 weeks like these other pests I've mentioned. They're here like all year. They're just the most damaging when they become adults in the late fall, which is also close to harvest. So whenever you spray something, you have to pay attention to the pre-harvest interval. So I believe 7, I don't know if it has a 14-day pre-harvest interval or what it is, but eventually you kind of get too late in the year to even really spray anything, so you just have to deal with the damage they're going to cause. As you get into harvest, something you're going to run into is yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets love to eat the grape sugars, especially if you're getting bird damage. So this will be kind of like year 3 and beyond when you're really starting to get grapes. It's really important to net, especially the red grapes, because they're basically bird magnets. I use side netting for this vineyard. You can do nets that go over the top, but my vines just grow so high. Side netting works best. But if you don't net, the birds will poke a hole in the berry, and then the bald-faced hornets and yellow jackets will go crazy on the vines. So what I like to do in the springtime is trap the queens. In the springtime, I put out yellow jacket traps, and I catch probably, I don't know, a dozen queens maybe, and it seems to really knock down the pressure, because if you knock down the queens, you knock down the nests, and there's just generally less yellow jackets in the neighborhood. You can see now I've grown grass in the rows of the vineyard, and the reason I do this is because I'm at a stage where I don't want to promote growth anymore. I actually want to tamp down the vigor. These vines grow very vigorously to the point where it's hard to manage. And if you have too much vegetal growth, it'll shade the clusters and you actually won't ripen like you want. So you want just the right amount of vegetal growth. Grass kind of helps compete with the vines, especially for water, and it just kind of helps to slow things down a little bit. You can see my dog here. She loves trying to catch the bees. It's really good for her. So as you get in year 3, year 4, year 5, when you get into that big wall of grapes, I'm gonna start shoot positioning. I'll run basically, position these shoots through the wires here. It's gonna start getting so thick, like I said, that it's gonna start shading the cluster. So what I'll do is I'll pull leaves and expose the clusters. I'll pull, especially on the east side of the vine in the fruit zone, I'll pull almost all the leaves. So that allows it to dry out better, lets the air flow through it, lets it get that morning sun to, again, help dry it. And just that extra sun exposure to the berries is gonna help to ripen them. I'll actually also pull about maybe half or so of the leaves on the fruit zone on the west side. The reason I don't pull everything on the west side is that west side sun is a little bit hotter than the east side, and it can just sunburn the grapes. Normally you're gonna put your row orientation north to south like this, and the reason being is you're gonna get kind of the fullest sun exposure. You're not gonna have one side of the grapes that's completely shaded. And also, if you had one side facing the south, you're gonna get really intense sun, and that sunburn issue really becomes a problem. So the backpack sprayer I mentioned works pretty well for these small vineyards. But as I get so thick and filled out here, what I run into is I have a lot of trouble with spray penetration. So I'll get the leaves well, but there might be a couple layers thick of leaves, and those clusters, sometimes they're really tight, and I just can't get the sprays into there. So I run into a lot of mildew issues. And once the mildew's here, now the spores are here. So you get a rain and it just goes crazy. So what I did this year is I made kind of a DIY air blast sprayer. So all these big vineyards are gonna use air blast sprayers, where they have these massive tractor PTO driven fans that put a air velocity behind the spray nozzles to help kind of fluff up the leaves and also just push that spray into there. I used a little electric leaf blower in conjunction with a backpack sprayer. You can see how I did that on my Patreon page, patreon.com/makewine. So if that's something that interests you, it will be worth checking that out. I think it's gonna make a big difference in just pretty much eliminating mildew, black rot, botrytis, these things that really slam us on these areas where we get more rain than we need. You'll notice I haven't mentioned watering. I mean, the first year you're gonna wanna water a little bit until those roots establish, but beyond that, unless you live somewhere really, really dry, you're almost never gonna have to water the vines. They don't need a lot of water. You actually don't want a lot of water because you want to make these kind of smaller, more concentrated berries in most cases, especially with the red wines. A little bit less important with the white wines. If you do live somewhere where it's so dry that you have to water it, just use some sort of dripper system. Don't use an overhead spray system because you don't want to wet the leaves more than you have to encourage things like powdery mildew, which is what you're going to get in those super dry climates. You can see I do have an overhead spray system, but that's going to be purely for preventing frost damage, and that's the last resort. I basically never want to use that. So again, these, as you get established, you really want to make grapes. In order to make grapes, you have to make sure that your buds don't get frosted. So there's a couple things you can do to try to prevent that. The main thing is to try to delay bud burst. Bud burst is when the buds start to open up and this leafy shoot pops out of them. That's when the grape becomes really vulnerable to frost. So what I'll do is I'll prune really late. I'll leave hundreds and hundreds of buds on these grapevines, and they usually bud out from the top down, but the buds I'm gonna keep are on the bottom. So that really helps me to hold back those buds at the bottom until the risk of frost is essentially over, ideally. This year I double pruned, so I basically pruned to about here, and then I came through after frost risk was about over and things were starting to leaf out more than I wanted anyways, and I did my final pruning where I leave about 5 or 6 canes per foot. I may still have to do some shoot thinning here and there where I've got just a little bit too much density. We'll see how that goes. A third thing I'll do for frost, I'm not sure if I said 1 or 2, but I'll spray some potassium. So I'll use potassium sulfate, and what that'll do is lower the freezing temperature inside that leaf by like 1 or 2 degrees, and it might be just enough to get you through that frost. That's usually what's going on. You're just right on the edge of survival usually when these frosts come through. To encourage more premium grapes, especially with like your red wines, what you'll often do is cluster thin a little bit. So right as these grapes start changing from green to red, which happens usually sometime in August for me, what I'll do is I'll snip off a few clusters. So each cane will usually make 3 clusters, sometimes 2. Well, any of them that are making 3, I'm gonna snip them down to 2. If you're really concerned about fully ripening, like you think you're gonna run out of season before these grapes really ripen, you can actually snip them down to 1 cane per cluster. You're gonna lose a lot of weight in grapes, so you're gonna have to weigh, pun intended, if that's really worth it for you. Are you gonna take the potential improvement in quality and trade that off for the loss of tonnage? And beyond that, it's just simple stuff. I keep it mowed. If you use a string trimmer, just be super careful you don't damage the trunks. You may want to actually spray like a foot circle around each vine rather than use a string trimmer. I'll tension my wire strainers once in a while. It seems like even though these posts are holding good, for whatever reason, I still have to tension these about once a year. I hope that covered all your vineyard questions. If you have any more, make sure to mention them in the comments, or if there's anything you'd really like to know in general about growing a backyard vineyard, I'd love to hear about it. Thanks for watching.